Denver Street Stories.
We amplify the stories of the unhoused community by giving them the platform they deserve to genuinely express their views. We must hold space for the voices of the most vulnerable in our fight towards collective liberation and equity for all. The opinions and views expressed in our interviews are not necessarily shared by Denver Street Stories.
Hey, this is Denver Street Stories, and we're here with Terese of House Action Network Denver. Denver Street Stories is a platform and podcast to help amplify homeless and unhoused voices. And House Action Network is a really wonderful advocacy group as well. Can you tell us a little bit about House Action Network in Denver?
Sure, yeah. So House Action Network Denver, or HAND for short, is an organization whose our purpose is to organize with houseless people for rights and housing as directed by houseless people at large. So our foundation is really outreach and is ensuring that all of the things that we're fighting for are driven by the experiences and the voices and the direction of people who are without housing or have been without housing or could be without housing. And, we do that through a lot of outreach, a lot of surveys, a lot of interviews, a lot of just on-ground connection and relationship that then grounds a lot of sort of policy, legislative, direct action, all sorts of work with the basic purpose of defending our rights and fighting for housing for all. We believe that housing is a human right, not a commodity for the rich, and we try to do all we can to make that a reality.
That's really excellent. I'm super impressed by that, and I think a really important thing that a lot of organizations really can't get quite right that you guys do so well is that you actually take a lot of firsthand perspective and direction from people who are experiencing the housing crisis right now, and that's so important to have actual people struggling with these issues kind of directing and helping to inform this whole organization. I think that's so important and so awesome. So in regards to some of the things that House Action Network does for the unhoused and homeless community, you mentioned that there's a lot of, you recently, I believe, took a survey that was huge. It was like, how many people was that?
828 houseless people in Denver.
That's massive, and that's excellent. Can you discuss some of the main findings that kind of came out of that survey, and what if there were like a couple key points that just an average person in Denver you'd really want them to take away from that?
Yeah, I can talk on that for a long time. So the report that is based on this survey of 828 houseless people, together with 4 community forums that we held, including one specifically for Black houseless folks, one specifically for Spanish-speaking houseless folks, and one specifically for queer houseless folks, as well as a general one. So we had all of those forums, and then we also did 38 in-depth individual interviews and did a bunch of ongoing sort of peer input process on the survey findings. So altogether, over 1,000 houseless people in Denver gave their direction to this. And what we called the report is Pipe Dreams and Picket Fences. And that's really based on a couple of quotes that are representative of a lot of themes we hear throughout the survey and found in our report. And one of those is really that housing is just a pipe dream. That the kind of quality housing that people want is not something that people feel much hope for getting or have experienced hope in getting. And then secondly, the picket fences really points to the dream homes and the visions and ideals that people do have for housing. Mm-hmm. So another theme in our survey was really that folks have dreams and visions for the kind of housing that people want, like any person, and that's not just I want to be stuffed in a small box with 4 walls and a roof. It's I want a picket fence, and this person iterates that in their quote. So those are a couple of quotes that we felt was representative of a lot of themes in the report that we used for the name of the report, Yeah, so we asked 24 questions all about housing. questions about people's experience trying to access housing, questions about people's desire and priorities for housing, questions about barriers, questions about vouchers. And all of this, gives us a picture of, okay, what is the actual housing that people want and what are the reasons that, we're not getting there. So there's a lot, but to start out with, it's really important to note that we asked different questions related to, do people actually want housing? And every way that we asked that question, the answer is basically overwhelmingly yes. Between 93 and 99% of people we surveyed clearly state that they want housing.
Wow.
The first question that we asked was, when you talk about wanting housing, what are you thinking of? It was a really open-ended question, and only 8 people specifically stated that they did not want housing.
Out of
Out of
812?
828
Oh,
people.
28. Wow.
So only less than 1% of people specifically stated that they did not want housing. Other questions, we get similar sorts of responses at different levels, but by and large, what we see clearly is folks want housing. But what's critical is the kind of housing. The number one priority that came out of people's open-ended answers around desires for housing was things around personal qualities. So like things about safety, community, autonomy, privacy. Those types of issues are the things that came up the very most, and that's true throughout the entire survey.
Can you say again what those were? What the?
Safety, community, autonomy, and privacy are top issues that come up again and again.
I feel like in a lot of temporary and transitional housing, safety is a priority in them, but privacy and autonomy diminish a little bit. That strikes me as an interesting thing that people really. I mean, it makes sense that people really value that.
Yeah, it's so, that should not go unnoticed, because a lot of housing that is built specifically for poor people or houseless people does not include those qualities. So, for example, around autonomy, there's a lot of rules that are placed on poor people housing or houseless person housing that are not placed on other standard, traditional housing. And we asked questions later in our survey too about the type of rules that people want or don't want in housing. And the top one was curfew, that people don't want a curfew. The second top one, just under that, is rules related to not having guests or live-in partners. And this is overwhelmingly true throughout the survey. Again and again, through various questions, people brought up issues with needing the freedom to be able to have a guest or to have a live-in partner or family stay with you.
Absolutely. Those curfews and then having limits on guests and time frame, that sounds super restrictive, and I can't. That would be not only difficult to manage in your day-to-day life with personal things, but also if you have a curfew, that how are you going to make it from your job to your curfew? Your employer is not always going to be able to accommodate you on that, and it just makes struggles and barriers more prominent for people who are already having a lot of difficulty with housing.
Exactly.
In regards to the other points in the survey, what are some other barriers, not necessarily when it comes to what kind of housing people are looking for, but what are some other barriers that people felt were really prominent for them in actually getting housing and going through the current resources that Denver does have to offer?
Yeah, so by far the top barrier, by like 4 times higher than any other one, was financial. Basically, not having money or just the unaffordability of housing. And that we see again throughout the survey, that issues related to the high cost of housing is the number one reason that folks cannot access housing. And that's, can't go without saying, because if we're going to talk about solutions to houselessness and not talk about how we're going to change the affordability levels of housing on a mass scale, then we're really not talking about solutions to houselessness. And that is the current state of things. That is, if you look at the trends nationwide, it is not a trend to create housing that's affordable. We also asked a question in the survey about what price housing would need to be for folks to afford it.
I remember that. Yeah.
And 17% of folks said that they needed it to be free, and then everybody else can pay something. So, most people can pay something, though not everybody. And 88% of people need it to be under $1,000 a month. There's a small number that can pay higher, but yeah, and so the range within that is it just a steady range of some folks that need it to be 200, some that 400 and 600 and so on and so forth. And so, that's the kind of price ranges that we need. So in addition to the number one barrier of affordability, the other next sort of barriers, actually credit score ranked second. So the challenges of having a bad credit score or having, landlords that discriminate based on credit records and so on, was second. If I'm going to forget the orders of these a little bit, but I think third was like the bureaucracy and paperwork, just the complications and issues with bureaucracy and paperwork. Related to that also was not having phones or internet was ranked pretty high. Having felony charges ranked pretty high. I can't remember exactly the full order of all of the barriers, but those were some of the top ones that came up.
I want to piggyback on something that you mentioned, that you said 88% of the people, they said that they could afford, or it would be reasonable, under $1,000. Is that accurate?
Recognizing that some of those people need it to be free, some of those people would be 200. So it's not that they all could pay it at 1,000. But
yeah. And I just, to people listening and watching, I want you to think about how much you're currently paying for your mortgage or your rent and how that would relate to you. And if you're in a luxury condo, that's $1,800 for a studio, or if you're in a room share kind of situation where you're at only $500, $600, $700, the people that were interviewed in this survey, it doesn't really sound like they're that different from people who are able to get into housing, and recognizing the intersectionality in this is really important to understanding the issues that they have to go through, whether that's generational wealth, whether that, like you said, credit score in this. There's systemic oppression that is affecting people as well. And all these things, I think, are really important to understand how the grand scheme of it all fits together, and how really fortunate some individuals are who do actually have, even if it's $700-800, they have a place to be, and how we should be thinking about, it's an attainable dream to be able to get housing for folks. And it is really important to not separate and think that people just, they can't do it, when that's not an unreasonable thing. That's not an unreasonable. I'm personally a fan of the free housing 100%, but it's, people shit on homeless folks a lot, saying that, oh, they just want handouts. They just, the narrative is terrible about it. And that survey really highlights that these are not unreasonable asks. These are just basic things that are very reasonable.
Yeah, and it's not the houseless person's problem that our market has made housing unaffordable.
Absolutely.
And so, it's funny. This is sort of maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but when we say like, talking about wanting handouts, it's funny because actually, so in our report, we also did a bunch of research on public housing and federal trends in spending around public and low-income housing. And so that's tied into this whole report also. And there's more money being put towards the tax interest deductions for rich people. So basically, homeowner deductions, if you own your home and you're well off, and this is primarily for folks that are making over $100,000 a year, you can get a tax deduction related to owning your home. And there's more money that is going to rich folks for subsidizing their home ownership than there is the entire HUD budget.
Wow.
So the HUD is the sorry, I can't even talk here. The housing department in the state, the federal, God,
You
the
good?
federal
Good.
housing department, HUD, Office of Housing Department. Anyway, they that entire budget, which is supposed to be for quote unquote poor people housing, and is really not. Actually, that entire budget includes housing that's for a range of incomes. But anyway, that's significantly less than the spending that goes to rich folks for housing. So when we talk about handouts, rich folks are getting more handouts from the federal government for their housing than poor folks, because there's really no difference between a subsidy for a rich person housing through a tax deduction and a subsidy for a poor person housing through a subsidy of a rental assistance or of a voucher or whatnot. It's the
Absolutely.
same thing. It's just one person is getting the money through a tax deduction and the other person is getting the money through a subsidy. So
Absolutely.
we're the point is we're giving handouts, and we're giving those handouts to rich folks, not poor folks.
I hate that I'm not surprised about this, and I've never owned a home, but I've heard about this before, and it seems not only to be imbalanced in the actual outcome of where those handouts are going to, but the narrative surrounding it is harmful, and not towards people who have a lot, but to the people who have not. It seems very harmful because oftentimes I notice when people are considering charity or donations or paying attention to even the report that you guys put together so thoughtfully, there's still a negative narrative about homeless folks, whereas there is not a negative narrative in the same way about somebody who owns their own home.
Exactly.
So, in regards to affordability and some of the barriers people are experiencing, you mentioned phones and internet, and those are some basic resources I feel like people often take for granted. Having a phone in your pocket and having access to all of the internet almost all of the time, or being able to even just call somebody to ask them a question. That's something people take for granted a lot. And did you have a lot of people? You said that was like number 4 or something on the.
Yeah, I can't remember. It was about 4. It was very high. Yeah, I mean it's a major issue. So the process for seeking housing, which we could talk more about too, but the process is very, very, very difficult if you don't have a phone and internet, because you have to stay in constant contact with your caseworker, or if you're trying to do it sort of independently and find something on your own, you need to be calling apartments and putting in applications and so on, and then searching for places on the internet and finding the right places to apply and so on. And these days, pretty much everything is assumes that you have internet access and the ability to send emails and make phone calls and so on. So doing that process without good access to phones or internets is very, very, very challenging, to say the least. And a lot of folks are constantly losing phones, and there's not any sort of universal internet access. Even access at libraries is limited, and library hours are not always accessible. And COVID made that, of course, even worse. And so yeah, it's a challenge that is big, is real.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I don't know if I can go into the process related things too, or I can talk about other things also.
I'd love to hear a little bit about a process, but to bring things into a perspective for those people who do have homes, think about how it could have been just a mild annoyance or how difficult it was to find a place that you are happy with and feel comfortable with. And then imagine if you had to do that without a phone or without internet, or you had to do that with assistance from, government resources. That It's a lot. That sounds extraordinarily difficult to do just on your own, but to have these other barriers involved too, like y'all should think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just to add one caveat, also, or not caveat, one a note as related to this about process. So, one of the questions we asked in the survey was, "What is the process that you need to go through to get into housing?" Um, and overwhelmingly, the top two answers were one, program related, and two, access support. These were sort of the terms that we use to categorize these themes that came up. And what that really means is you have to go through a program, you have to have a case manager, and that's your only path to housing. And that is actually like very representative of of reality and of the data that we know is true, because pathways to housing that don't involve agencies, programs and case managers that are basically the gatekeeper for that entire housing process, um, are very few and far between. You have to be basically doing some sort of alternative housing option that's, maybe doubling up with a few people, or, renting somebody's basement, or, doing something that's, a different outside the box housing option. Because in terms of anything that is in the price range that folks can afford, things that are a few $100s, that means that it has to be under 30% area median income, which is like a level of affordability in the housing that is pretty much only built through programs. In this, you can look at the city's data about like housing, that different income levels, and if you get to that income level where you're talking about like a few $100s, almost all of it is through an agency, like a nonprofit that runs the housing. Um, Aside from the very few units of public housing that are left, or for with vouchers, and that's a whole other topic that we can talk about in depth. But anyway, yeah, it's just you know, basically you are waiting on a wait list for years for a case manager who's your gatekeeper, to open a pathway to a housing unit for an existing housing option, waiting for somebody to either die or get evicted. That's
Wow.
largely the case. There's of course there's some new units that come online, but by and large, folks are waiting for somebody to die or get evicted, and for their case manager to get in contact with them and open that opportunity.
So I'd really love to talk about the housing voucher process, but before that, I wanted to ask, are there some organizations that you feel like actually do a decent job of helping to connect people to housing in regards to case management?
It's a hard question. There's definitely some individual case managers that do a great job and that
Okay.
really work hard and do their very best. Um, but I don't know if we could say like this organization as a whole, like has all great case managers that are, all doing really great work.
Mhm.
I do really appreciate Reciprocity Collective for being um, more of a non-program related case management type of agency. So are they do case management stuff, but it's a little bit more based on it's coming more from houseless folks' needs and not as much coming from like the specific agency. So that's a good thing.
I love that.
But
Okay.
but yeah, by and large, it's a very very difficult job. Case managers are put in impossible positions of trying to navigate for, try you have 50 clients or more, and you get 5 possible housing openings, every month maybe. And so you're navigating trying to squeeze, like, okay, which of these 50 people am I going to get into these 5 slots that I have? So yeah, case managers are put in a very very difficult situation. And I don't need to get into all of the things about case management. We have a lot of recommendations about case management in our report. Yeah.
Can you list some of those recommendations if you were speaking towards like somebody who is trying to go
Yeah,
through
I mean,
this?
so part of it has to do with trying to have less turnover rate with case managers because there's an extremely high turnover rate. So we really encourage better pay, more training, um, better, supports and benefits for caseworkers so there's not as high of a turnover rate. Also really encourage pathways for houseless folks or formerly houseless folks to be in those positions or to be housing navigators to,
Mhm.
have those sorts of peer support kinds of options. Um, uh, Also, it's really what as understood by the talking about the barriers about phones and internet. Um, Part of that is made significantly worse by the fact that most case managers don't leave their offices and go with a person to find a unit. So you're literally like just leaving somebody on their own to go, um, you know, search the housing market and go to actual places physically and try to apply. Um, and so we really encourage in our recommendations that there is case managers are able to actually be on ground with folks, both in terms of outreach and in terms of like going to physical sites to help people navigate the housing process. Those are some of the things that I could think of, and then just a need for a real unity between um, case managers and sort of the providers in that world and houseless folks regarding the fact that our common our shared problem here is the system and the lack of actual affordable units.
Can you say that last part again?
Uh,
That last like common problem here.
yeah, we have a shared problem with folks in the provider world and case managers and houseless folks in that there is not actual affordable housing to go to. And yeah,
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I feel like a lot of people really need to understand that it is not an individual problem and that it is a kind of almost a community and an organizational problem, and there's a whole system that is really it's not adequately solving these needs.
it's not, and it's set up not to. And yeah, um, yeah, and I don't want to go off on too many tangents,
No, I like
side
it. I like
tangents,
it.
but yeah, I mean the system is set up to push people into subcategories where you're competing against others. Um, to qualify. That was another a big theme that came out in the question about process was about qualify, um, and the way that the federal government in particular, but also the state and local government, um, define houselessness and create the different funding streams for different housing options um, entirely requires that you be a part of a certain qualifying category to get into these different things. So it's abominable the fact that now the definition of chronic homelessness is such that you can only qualify for certain housing options if you've been houseless for 4 or more years for a certain
Wow.
period, or overlapping whatever. I can't even remember the definition. And then you have to like have a disability condition or be having a substance use problem. And so all of these things, it's just like, of course, it's going to pit the community against each other because you're creating these housing options only for very specific sort of subpopulations, um, and yeah, it's not the pathway to universal housing as a human right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like a lot of the people listening to this probably did not realize that's a you know uh, it's into the weeds of how these kinds of things function. And I feel like you know people need to learn about this more to understand these things, even if that individual themselves can't provide the solution. Understanding and furthering a positive narrative that aims to help people is really important. And that kind of thinking that you mentioned the division involved and pitting people against each other to qualify into these different categories. Like, I'm sure a lot of people don't think about that, and that also shouldn't be a thing at all. Um, to go back to something you mentioned previously, can we discuss the housing voucher program? I've heard that there's it's uh, There's a lot of hoops in that.
Yes, to say the least. So I don't want to get on too many tangents on the voucher system, but it's um, so it's important to know that housing vouchers, um, which are basically uh, a subsidy, like a ticket that you get from the government to pay for your housing in the private market. You have to go find a landlord in the private market that will rent to you with this voucher, and then this voucher um, uh, pays for the rent aside from a third. And so you have to pay a third of your income, um, whatever your income is. It could be zero, it could be, you know, dollars, whatever your income is, you have to pay a third of that towards the rent. Um, so it's an income based kind of system. Um, and But it's on the private market. It's entirely dependent on the private housing market and the prices that they're charging in the private housing market.
Which in Denver is astronomical.
It is. And so this system of basically the government paying landlords and, you know, for the private housing has become increasingly the go-to solution to houselessness, the go-to solution for poor people housing. You'll see Democrats, in particular in the federal government, really touting vouchers for all. This is the way that we're going to get out of this: is vouchers for all. And you know, well, I you know, it sounds nice, and I understand the drive for having housing options for all. This system is set up to perpetuate the capitalist housing market, where prices continue to rise, and you know, property owners continue to make more. It is also set up to serve less and less houseless people or poor people, because the prices keep going up, and the money that you're getting from the government to pay for these vouchers is only a certain pool of money that then pays for what it can based on the market prices, not based on the number of individuals and need. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of problems on the market level and on the sort of economic level of how the vouchers are perpetuating the raising rents and not creating affordable housing. And then there's also a whole bunch of issues regarding how the vouchers actually work for people to find housing. And so what you'll hear a lot about is the number of people that applied for a housing voucher, and then the number of people who had their name drawn for a housing voucher. And that's you know, something that's raised is, oh, there's a big gap here, and there's a very big gap, and that's obviously a clear indication that poor people need more housing that we can afford. So in Denver, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, didn't you guys get some numbers from that for the people like who have applied and who actually received housing?
So in Denver in 2021, there was roughly 20,000 people who applied for a housing voucher, and this is through the Denver Housing Authority vouchers. There's other types of vouchers, but just through that particular program, which is the biggest one. So roughly 20,000 people applied, and 1,000 names were drawn. So that's 1,000 vouchers that were supposed to be funded, and that you know, these were supposed to be for people to find housing with. Out of those 1,000 names drawn, this is where the parts that you don't hear about. So out of those 1,000 names drawn, only 340 actually, I'm sorry, 314, wrong number. Only 314 actually had a contact with the housing authority, whereby they were told, you have a voucher, come for this appointment. Then that jumps down to 240 that actually got the voucher in hand, because they were able to actually show up to a required appointment and get the voucher in hand. So it's only 240 out of the 1,000. And that 240 jumps down to 77 who were actually able to find housing to rent with that voucher. 77 out of 1,000 people who got the voucher actually got housing with the voucher. So it's
77 out of
8% of
20,000.
1,000, yeah.
8%.
And then out of 20,000, it's 0.4%. Out of the 20,000 that
0.4%.
applied, it's 0.4% that actually found a place to rent with that voucher.
And this is Denver. This is not a
Yeah,
federal
we're just
thing. This
talking
is
Denver.
Denver.
Well, it's federal funding. It's a
Yeah.
federal program, but it's in Denver we're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. So it's bad. It's real bad. And it's not something that's talked about. They try to cover it up. We had a hell of a time getting this data. Yeah.
This sounds, I mean, to think about, so you mentioned Democrats really touting vouchers, and I feel like in people who vote conservative oftentimes really lots of times are voting to defund a lot of public sector kind of things. And it seems like there's this weird 1-2 punch going on of like, we're going to defund the amount of money going towards these vouchers, and then the price of housing is going up, so each voucher can do less for people, and at the same time, those vouchers are getting promoted, and it's really delaying, or I don't know if delaying would be the right word, but it's not promoting a healthy narrative or healthy solutions to this. It seems like it's just making it look good with less impact almost.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's well said.
You said it really well. I can't believe that's an astounding fact and figure of 20,000, and after all is said and done, whittling it down to 77.
Yeah. Part of that is also the time frame. So there's a 120-day time frame that you have to find a housing unit. So once you get your voucher, if you don't find a place in 120 days, it expires. There is processes, and I say processes sort of vaguely because it's actually like really arbitrary, but there's ways that you could have it extended. But that's not a guarantee, and it doesn't happen most of the time. So by and large, after 120 days, people are not finding a place and their voucher expires, and then they have to go right back on the list. They don't just get a new voucher; they have to go into that 20,000 pool again and try to, get their name drawn.
That's absolutely insane.
And it's also, I mean, I don't want to keep going on this, but it's also important to note that only a very small fraction of those folks that applied for the Denver Housing Authority vouchers are actually houseless.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Thank you again for discussing all this with us. And to backtrack for a second, I would like to talk a little bit, if you can, about the forms and the intersectionality in regards to that. You mentioned that there was like a forum for the queer community here in Denver, the Latina community, the Black community. Can you discuss how that went? I think that's really awesome also that, there was a lot of focus and hopefully understanding about, different people's cultures and backgrounds.
Yeah. So each of these forums was facilitated by people who were in that community. So
Awesome.
I personally wasn't in all of those because I am not a part of all those communities. But we have notes and recordings of the whole one, all of these forums, and we looked at some of the themes that came out in our report, and it's actually really, there's some really interesting things. So, for example, in the Black or African descent houseless forum that was held, there was a lot of talk about vouchers, and that's something we know is that, like, because of our racial disparities and poverty and houselessness, and that so many Black folks are being pushed into houselessness and kept houseless. Vouchers are very common, and so there was a lot of talk about. Basically just like how the voucher system isn't working, how they were being pushed into other neighborhoods with vouchers, and stuff like that. Also, a lot of key themes around gentrification of key Black neighborhoods, like 5 Points. A lot of folks in this forum grew up in Denver, grew up in 5 Points, and are now being pushed out, and told stories of how that happened, how they lost their housing in 5 Points, how it was bought out by rich white folks, and just what needs to happen in terms of holding, taking back the community, and owning not just your own home, but owning the whole neighborhood as a community. That was a really strong theme that came out of that forum.
Sure.
And the Spanish speaking forum was also very interesting because quite the opposite was true there. There was no talk about vouchers. There
Mm.
was a question about, we had questions about vouchers, but people basically were like, what is that? I don't understand. And then the conversation was done because folks who are undocumented don't qualify for housing
Oh,
vouchers.
interesting. Okay.
And so, most of this community that was at this forum are folks who were undocumented, and I've never experienced or been told anything about a housing voucher because either just because of discrimination because they speak Spanish and they may be documented, or just because they are undocumented. Either way, both of these things lead to folks who are Spanish speaking or folks who are undocumented not getting vouchers.
Can I ask a question really quick
Yeah.
about that? I'm wondering if there are other organizations that you'd like to highlight that do really exemplify advocating for people who are undocumented and looking for housing. Is there any that you could shout out to that you feel like are doing a great job?
There are groups that do a great job. That there's not very much around that specifically working on housing for immigrant population. There's some great groups that do what they can in that regard. So American Friends Service Committee, we really work closely with, and they've done a lot of advocacy for immigrants and undocumented folks here in Denver and Colorado. Also, the Central Humanitario does a lot of like day labor support for folks. Central Humanitario.
Okay.
Both of those organizations are great, and there's others. There's CIRC that does a lot of like immigrant rights work, and I know that they all do what they can in terms of housing, but there's not really like a strong like organization that is doing specific work to connect folks with housing, folks who are undocumented primarily. Like so, the other thing that's really a key theme in that forum was work. People were constantly talking about work. More than anything else. So folks are trying to work enough to get enough money to rent a place, and that is by and large, what we see is that folks, are working as much as they possibly can, and then doubling up or tripling up or quadrupling up in housing, and that's the primary way that folks seem to be getting housing in that Spanish-speaking undocumented community.
Sure. I think that really highlights, that, one, everybody is really going through this, but if you are undocumented or you are struggling from the hurdles of systemic oppression, that's just going to make all of these things more difficult on top of all of that. And for people who have some sort of us and them mentality, breaking that mentality down to understand that this is a problem that we all face and other people might have more difficulties, so looking at them in an empathetic and considerate light is really important.
Yeah. And then the queer forum was, I'm trying to think of what the big themes were in there. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the shelter system in the queer forum regarding just how there's no safe place to be in the shelters or on the street, but especially in the shelters because it's all gender segregated. So you're either going to a man's shelter or a women's shelter, and there's one shelter that does their best to be fairly gender inclusive, but there's still some extreme challenges with that, especially if you're trans masc. It's really not a safe place for you. And yeah, so it's serious issue in terms of basically trying to navigate the shelter system if you're trans or queer. It was a big theme that came out of the queer community forum.
That is huge, and I think that's a really important thing to highlight, considering how trans people, and specifically trans people of color, experience much higher rates of violence and discrimination. So again, people who are considering or discussing the narratives of shelters, imagine how that goes for trans people and understanding how the differences might be. Well, Terese, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. You're a fountain of knowledge, and I'm super impressed. And ever since I've known you, have also been, I admire you so much for the work that you do with Hand. Denver Street Stories is a pretty new organization, and our main goal is to change the narrative surrounding homelessness so that people see everyone suffering from the housing crisis through a lens of compassion and understanding. Your network is doing so much, and I'm really grateful because you're doing important work that is, very informative and also very helpful. Thank you for doing that. Can you say a little bit more about Hand and any outro for you guys?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for doing what you're doing. This is incredibly important to get the voice of houseless folks out and to change the narrative, because we know that's fundamental to our pathway for actual housing for all. There is a pathway. We could have housing for all. It doesn't always have to be this way. It hasn't always been this way, and it could change. But a big part of that is that we need to quit looking at houseless people like trash, looking at houseless people like less than, blaming individuals, making it all about charity, and start looking at the systems, and start treating people like humans and asking houseless people what their real needs and priorities are, and taking that seriously in terms of what we do. So to that effect, I just want to say, like, I hope that folks who are watching this feel empowered that we can fight together for the housing that we all need, that we our voices matter, and that the priorities that we hear from houseless folks are the kinds of priorities you'd hear from anybody around wanting housing where you can be human, where you can have freedom, where you can have community. And let's not just shove that under the rug and, just continue to treat it like some, token project. You can push people into shelters and boxes and controlled environments, and that's how we're going to put everybody places. Let's change that and start talking about where people want to live, where human beings need to live, and what we can do as a society to make that a possibility, to make housing a human right and not a commodity for the rich. Oh, find out more about us at housekeysactionnetwork.com. Also on various social media platforms, including Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And come get involved.
And come check out denverstreetstories.org.
Thank you for listening to Denver Street Stories. We aim to change the narrative surrounding homelessness and hope to shed some light into a world often pushed aside and disregarded altogether. We should hate less, love, and listen more.